Think you're safe where you live? Think again. The United States has glaring vulnerabilities, and when an attack strikes, and yes, it's a matter of when, not if, some states will crumble into chaos overnight. Could your state be one of them? The so-called land of the free hides a harsh reality. Most of the U.S. isn't prepared for a crisis of any kind. When disaster hits, certain states are going to feel the brunt of it, leaving millions exposed, stranded, and fighting for survival. Forget the illusion of safety. It's paper thin and will vanish in an instant. Shortages of food, water, and medical supplies will hit hard, while infrastructures designed to protect us will collapse under pressure. If you're in one of these 10 states, you need to pay attention because knowing the risks could make the difference between survival and being left behind. When the unimaginable becomes reality, some states won't just struggle, they'll break. Evacuation plans? Most are flawed at best and non-existent at worst. In an attack, the roads will be gridlocked, supplies will vanish, and emergency services will be overwhelmed in hours. The question isn't whether things will get bad, it's how quickly they'll spiral out of control. That's why we've ranked the 10 worst states to be in during an attack on the U.S. Let's dive in. 1. California. California isn't just a weak spot, it's practically a neon target. Bursting with high-value assets, it's a dream scenario for anyone planning an attack. Take the massive naval bases in San Diego and the Port of Los Angeles, both critical for U.S. military mobility across the Pacific. If these go offline, the country loses vital supply lines and command hubs overnight. Then there's Silicon Valley, the beating heart of America's tech infrastructure. It's not just a hub for innovation, it powers defense systems, banking networks, and nationwide communications. Take it down, and the ripple effect plunges the U.S. into technological darkness. California's urban centers are another major vulnerability. Los Angeles, with over 10 million people crammed into its sprawl, would be a nightmare during an evacuation. Think about it. Gridlocked highways, panicked residents, and emergency services stretched beyond their limits. This is a state already grappling with droughts and resource shortages. A crisis would amplify those issues tenfold, leaving millions desperate for basics like food and water. Speaking of food, California supplies over a third of the nation's vegetables and 2/3 of its fruits and nuts. Disrupting this state's agricultural output wouldn't just cripple California, it would starve the country. In a national emergency, California's reliance on stable supply chains makes it far less self-sufficient than it seems. And don't forget its extensive coastline and open invitation for sea-based threats like missile strikes or amphibious assaults. In short, California may look like paradise, but in a national crisis, it's a disaster waiting to happen. 2. New York. If California is a bullseye, New York is the bullseye's center. New York City alone, the largest and most densely populated metropolis in the country, is an irresistible target. It's home to the United Nations headquarters, Wall Street, and critical media networks that control the nation's narrative. A single blow here could send shockwaves through the global economy, media, and diplomacy. Wall Street, where trillions of dollars move daily, represents America's financial heartbeat. Disrupt that, and economic collapse isn't just a possibility, it's a certainty. Now consider the city's population density. Over 8 million people packed into a relatively small area. In a crisis, emergency services, hospitals, and food supplies would buckle within hours. Grocery shelves would be stripped bare, pharmacies would run out of essential medications, and chaos would take over. New York's food supply is a ticking time bomb. The state relies heavily on imports, with most of the city's food traveling thousands of miles. If those supply lines snap, hunger would set in within days. Major distribution centers like those in the Bronx could be easily targeted. cutting off the city's nutritional lifeline. The situation grows even grimmer when you consider the aging population and residents with chronic health conditions. Without access to consistent food and medical care, survival becomes a near impossible challenge. New York's vulnerabilities extend far beyond its urban centers. Its reliance on external resources and dense population make it one of the worst places to be when disaster strikes. 3. Texas might look like a fortress, but it's sitting on a powder keg. Known as the energy capital of the U.S., this state is home to some of the largest oil refineries and energy production facilities in the country. If Texas goes down, the entire nation feels it, period. This isn't just about gasoline for cars. We're talking about diesel for trains, planes, and essential equipment that keeps the country running. Cut that supply off, and you've got an energy crisis rippling across every industry. But Texas isn't just an energy powerhouse. It's also an agricultural giant. Essential crops like cotton, cattle, and other food staples flow from here to feed millions. If these supply chains are disrupted, the nation faces skyrocketing food prices, pushing already strained families to the brink. Texas's cities like Houston and Dallas add another layer of vulnerability. These dense urban centers aren't prepared for mass evacuations or prolonged supply shortages. Grocery stores would be stripped bare in hours, and with distribution networks dependent on trucking and rail lines, any disruption spells disaster. Now factor in the climate. Texas's extreme heat is unforgiving, especially without power or clean water. Dehydration becomes a deadly threat, particularly for children, the elderly, and those with health conditions. Let's not forget the state's significant military assets: Fort Hood, Lackland Air Force Base, and more. These aren't just targets, they're hazards. Any breach of these facilities could expose civilians to chemical, biological, or radiological dangers. Bottom line, Texas is the linchpin of energy, food, water, and military strength. Take it out, and the ripple effects will be catastrophic, both locally and nationally. 4. Florida's vulnerabilities are off the charts. With critical military assets like the U.S. Southern Command and multiple Air Force bases, plus massive population centers like Miami and Orlando, this state is an exposed nerve. Its strategic position makes it an entry point for threats from the Gulf and Atlantic, leaving it vulnerable on all fronts: land, sea, and air. Evacuation? Not likely. Florida's geography and crowded highways make it nearly impossible to get millions of residents out in a crisis. Highways would become instant choke points, leaving people stranded as chaos unfolds. Florida's dense cities, like Miami and Tampa, are heavily reliant on imported food and supplies. This state consumes far more than it produces, making it incredibly vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. Grocery store shelves would empty within hours, and Florida's dependence on perishables would lead to rapid nutritional deficiencies. Water is another Achilles heel. Despite being surrounded by water, Florida relies on freshwater aquifers for drinking water. These can be easily contaminated or depleted, especially during a crisis. Add the state's sweltering heat and humidity, and you've got a recipe for heat exhaustion, dehydration, and widespread suffering. Without air conditioning, conditions would deteriorate fast, especially for vulnerable populations like the elderly. Florida's military bases are prime targets. Southern Command, which oversees operations in Latin America and the Caribbean, is critical for regional and national security. Any disruption here could allow hostile forces easier access to U.S. soil. In short, Florida's beautiful coastline and sunny weather mask a harsh reality. In a crisis, it's a logistical nightmare. From food and water shortages to failed evacuation plans, Florida would descend into chaos and collapse. 5. Virginia isn't just a target. It's the heart of national security. With the Pentagon, the U.S. Department of Defense, and countless government agencies concentrated in the Washington, D.C. metro area, this state is the epicenter of America's intelligence and decision-making power. An attack here wouldn't just cripple Virginia, it would destabilize the entire country. The Pentagon is an obvious bullseye. A disruption here would sever command chains and paralyze the nation's defense network. In a crisis, losing the Pentagon means losing the ability to respond strategically, leaving the U.S. vulnerable on every front. Virginia's proximity to D.C. also makes it a high-risk zone for cascading effects. The state's infrastructure, from transportation to energy, is deeply intertwined with federal operations. Any breakdown would have a domino effect, disrupting essential services far beyond the state's borders. Adding to the vulnerability is the state's population density and reliance on imports for food and supplies. Virginia's urban areas, especially those near D.C., would face immediate shortages, leaving residents scrambling for essentials. And with nuclear facilities and other critical infrastructure nearby, the risks multiply. Simply put, Virginia is ground zero for mass chaos in a serious crisis. The stakes here aren't just local, they're national. 6. Washington might seem like a haven with its lush green landscapes and tech-driven economy, but in a crisis, this state's vulnerabilities become glaring. As the home of tech giants like Amazon and Microsoft, Washington is an economic and technological powerhouse. However, this also makes it a prime target. Disrupting Washington isn't just a blow to the Pacific Northwest, it's a nationwide blackout. Washington houses some of the most critical tech infrastructure in the country, including cloud storage, data centers, and servers that power everything from financial systems to social media. Knock out Washington, and you're cutting off America's digital lifeline. Banking, healthcare records, and even government operations could grind to a halt, plunging the nation into chaos. Seattle, the state's largest city, is densely populated and heavily reliant on imported food and supplies. While Washington's agriculture is robust, it's specialized. Apples, wheat, and potatoes dominate production. This limited variety can't sustain the urban population if supply chains are severed. Grocery store shelves would empty within hours, leaving residents scrambling for canned goods and non-perishables. Nutritional deficiencies would hit quickly, particularly for children, the elderly, and those with specific dietary needs. Water security is another major concern. Despite Washington's reputation for rain, most of that water isn't safe to drink without purification. The state relies on reservoirs and advanced filtration systems that could be easily compromised. In an attack, water contamination risks would skyrocket. Residents might resort to collecting rainwater or face dehydration and waterborne illnesses. Military assets in Washington, such as Joint Base Lewis McChord and Naval Base Kitsap, add to the state's strategic importance. These installations house critical military technology and nuclear deterrence capabilities. An attack on these facilities wouldn't just threaten Washington, it would compromise national security. Washington's reliance on digital infrastructure, imported essentials, and specialized agriculture makes it one of the most precarious places in a national crisis. Without its tech backbone and supply chains, this state teeters on the brink of collapse. 7. Hawaii. Hawaii may look like paradise, but in a crisis, it's a logistical nightmare. Its breathtaking isolation, 2,500 miles from the mainland, becomes a glaring vulnerability when the unexpected strikes. This remoteness means Hawaii is almost entirely dependent on imports for food, fuel, and essential supplies. About 90% of the state's food comes from outside sources. If shipping routes are disrupted, grocery store shelves wouldn't just empty. They'd stay empty. Within days, the islands would face critical shortages of fresh produce, protein, and medical supplies. Residents would be forced to ration whatever they have, and the state's limited local agriculture wouldn't come close to meeting the demand. Water security is another weak point. While Hawaii receives plenty of rain, much of it isn't immediately drinkable. The state depends on advanced filtration and storage systems to provide clean drinking water. Any damage to these systems could leave residents scrambling for alternatives, risking dehydration and illness. Hawaii's reliance on energy imports compounds the problem. Fuel for electricity and transportation comes almost entirely from outside sources. Without a steady flow, the islands would face blackouts, leaving residents without refrigeration, communication, or even basic transportation. Military installations, including Pearl Harbor and key Pacific command centers, make Hawaii a strategic target. An attack on these bases could compromise U.S. military operations across the Pacific, leaving not just Hawaii, but the entire nation vulnerable to further threats. Hawaii's beauty hides a harsh truth. Its isolation is both its charm and its Achilles heel. In a crisis, the state's reliance on imports and limited local resources makes survival an uphill battle. Illinois, and particularly Chicago, stands as a critical economic and transportation hub for the United States. However, in a crisis, this status flips into a major liability. Chicago isn't just another city, it's the heart of America's Midwest, controlling railways, highways, and one of the world's busiest airports, O'Hare International. Disrupting Illinois is akin to cutting off a central artery in the nation's logistics network. The state's extensive rail lines and highways are lifelines, moving essential goods such as food, medical supplies, and fuel across the country. Any significant disruption here would ripple nationwide, causing supplies to falter and shipments to stall. The goods Americans rely on daily could end up stranded, leaving shelves bare far beyond Illinois' borders. The food situation is particularly grim. With a population nearing 3 million, Chicago relies heavily on daily shipments to stock its grocery stores. Once those supply chains snap, fresh produce, protein sources, and basic staples like bread and dairy would vanish almost instantly. Residents would have no choice but to turn to emergency rations, which wouldn't last long. Nutritional deficiencies would escalate quickly, with children, the elderly, and those with specific dietary needs being the hardest hit. Winters in Illinois add another layer of peril. Chicago's brutal cold demands a constant flow of heating fuel, primarily natural gas. Without it, residents would face life-threatening exposure to freezing temperatures. Hypothermia and respiratory illnesses would rise, particularly among vulnerable populations, compounding the crisis. Water security is no less precarious. Chicago sources its drinking water from Lake Michigan, but any compromise in infrastructure could cut off or contaminate this supply. If water treatment systems fail, the risk of waterborne illnesses would skyrocket. Residents would be forced to ration dwindling supplies or resort to unsafe sources, leading to dehydration and widespread health crises. Adding to the danger is Illinois' significant number of nuclear power plants, such as those in Byron and Braidwood. These facilities could become prime targets in an attack, and any breach would unleash a radiological catastrophe affecting the entire Midwest. The fallout would devastate lives, agriculture, and the environment for miles around. Illinois isn't just another state, it's a linchpin in America's food, transportation, and energy networks. An attack here wouldn't just cripple Illinois, it would send shockwaves across the nation, plunging millions into chaos. 9. Georgia. Georgia is a ticking time bomb in any national emergency. Atlanta isn't just the state's capital, it's the busiest transportation hub in the world, thanks to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. If this critical hub were cut off, flights nationwide would grind to a halt. The immediate consequences would include immobilized troops, grounded supply deliveries, and a complete stoppage of resource movement across the country. Georgia's vast network of highways and railways also serves as a lifeline for the entire Southeast. These routes move food, fuel, and other essentials to millions across the region. A disruption in Georgia would effectively leave half the South stranded, with its supply chain already stretched to the breaking point. Ironically, despite being one of the most agricultural states in the country, Georgia's urban areas, including Atlanta and Savannah, rely heavily on food imports to feed their dense populations. Daily deliveries keep grocery store shelves stocked, but once these falter, those shelves would empty in a matter of hours. Residents would be left scrambling for whatever canned goods or dried staples remain. The collapse of nutritional access would be swift and devastating. Fresh vegetables, meat, dairy, everything essential for a balanced diet would become unattainable. Malnutrition would set in quickly, weakening the health and resilience of Georgia's people just when they need it most. Water security poses another critical challenge. Georgia's water supply is centralized and highly dependent on consistent infrastructure. In a crisis, this system could falter, leaving millions without reliable access to clean water. Dehydration and waterborne diseases would follow, exacerbating the state's already dire situation. Georgia's strategic importance and its dependence on vulnerable infrastructure make it a high-risk state in any national emergency. With transportation, food, and water systems teetering on collapse, the state would struggle to maintain basic survival for its residents, plunging it into chaos almost immediately. 9. Georgia. Georgia faces a unique set of vulnerabilities in a crisis, particularly due to its reliance on centralized systems and its critical role in transportation. Atlanta, the state's bustling capital, is the busiest transportation hub in the world, with Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport at its core. If this key airport were taken offline, the consequences would ripple far beyond Georgia. Military mobilizations would stall, critical supplies couldn't be flown in, and the movement of resources across the country would grind to a halt. The state's highways and railways are just as vital, acting as lifelines for the entire Southeast. These routes move food, fuel, and other necessities to millions. Disrupting them would leave the southern United States stranded, dependent on a supply chain already stretched thin. Despite its agricultural reputation, Georgia's cities, including Atlanta and Savannah, rely heavily on imported food. Grocery stores are restocked daily, and if supply chains falter, shelves would be stripped bare within hours. Residents would be left scrambling for scraps, canned goods, dried pasta, and whatever they can hoard. Fresh produce, meat, and dairy would vanish overnight, leaving a population struggling with malnutrition when strength and resilience are most needed. Water scarcity compounds the problem. Even in normal times, Atlanta is vulnerable to droughts and water shortages. During a crisis, clean water becomes a rare luxury. Without reliable purification and consistent supply, the situation could spiral rapidly. Dehydration and heat exhaustion, especially during Georgia's scorching summers, would become life-threatening. Hospitals would be overwhelmed, and contaminated water sources would lead to outbreaks of waterborne diseases, adding another layer of chaos. Georgia's military infrastructure, including Fort Benning, Fort Stewart, and Robins Air Force Base, makes it a prime target. These aren't just bases, they're essential training and logistics centers for U.S. defense. If compromised, Georgia's military capability would crumble, leaving the state and potentially the entire Southeast defenseless and exposed to further threats. The stakes rise even higher when you consider Georgia's power infrastructure. Nuclear plants, like Plant Vottle, pose an immense risk. A hit to one of these facilities would result in a radiological catastrophe, affecting land, water, and air for miles. Radiation doesn't respect state lines, and such an incident would displace populations, poison agriculture, and devastate the region for years to come. Georgia may be the heart of the South, but in a national emergency it becomes a fragile trap. From food and water shortages to compromised defense and energy systems, Georgia's vulnerabilities could buckle under pressure, sending shock waves of disaster across the Southeast. 10th, Pennsylvania is often overlooked in discussions about national preparedness, but it is one of the most precariously positioned states in the country. Philadelphia, home to over 1.6 million people, represents a dense urban maze of aging infrastructure and vulnerable transportation networks. Far from just a city of historical landmarks, it's a high-risk zone that could descend into chaos in the blink of an eye. The state's highways, railways, and ports are the lifeblood of the East Coast and Midwest, moving billions of dollars worth of goods daily. If these supply lines were cut, the ripple effects would choke critical resource flows nationwide. Pennsylvania's urban centers, particularly Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, are heavily reliant on imported food. Grocery stores would be picked clean within hours of a disruption, leaving residents with only canned goods and junk food. Essential nutrients from fresh produce, protein, and dairy would disappear, sparking a health crisis marked by malnutrition, weakened immune systems, and desperation. Water security is equally fragile. Pennsylvania's water systems, especially in urban areas like Philadelphia, are centralized, outdated, and vulnerable. A disruption, be it from contamination, power loss, or a direct attack, would leave millions scrambling for drinkable water. Hospitals and emergency responders wouldn't be able to cope with the demand for clean water, turning what could be a manageable crisis into a full-blown public health catastrophe. Adding to these vulnerabilities are Pennsylvania's nuclear power plants, such as Limerick and Beaver Valley. These plants are critical power sources, but they also pose catastrophic risks in an emergency. A breach or failure could release radioactive material, poisoning land, air, and water for miles. With Limerick just 21 miles from Philadelphia, millions would be at immediate risk. Evacuation efforts would be nightmarish, with clogged highways, overwhelmed emergency services, and a radiological disaster forcing mass displacements and rendering land uninhabitable. Energy infrastructure is another Achilles heel. Pennsylvania is one of the nation's largest natural gas producers, powering homes and industries up and down the East Coast. Any disruption to this production would send energy prices soaring, forcing families to choose between food and heat during the harsh winter months. In a crisis, Pennsylvania's dense urban population would make evacuation and emergency response nearly impossible. Hospitals would be overrun, pharmacies stripped bare, and emergency services stretched so thin they'd be rendered ineffective. Social order would quickly deteriorate, plunging cities into chaos. As the Keystone State, Pennsylvania's vulnerabilities are felt far beyond its borders. A hit here would send shock waves up and down the eastern seaboard, turning a regional emergency into a national catastrophe. The time to prepare is now. Don't wait until it's too late. Start taking simple, actionable steps today. Stockpile essential supplies, map out evacuation routes, and build a plan that works for your family. Knowledge and readiness are your best defenses in an unpredictable world. If you found this video helpful, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into staying prepared for the unexpected. Your future self will thank